more on this, Sven Harmeling joins us now from Bonn in Germany. He's the global policy lead at Climate Change at CARE, which is an international NGO. Sven, good to have you on the show. Now, we're going to try to get both sides of the argument here. Now, according to Greta, this is coming out all too late for far too in the distance. I mean, does she have a point?
Well, I think she definitely has a point because, I mean, while the proposal for this law basically, to some extent, fills a certain legislatory gap in the EU, and we know there are other climate laws existing in the EU, for example, the emissions trading system, etc., it falls far short from what is needed. It doesn't provide a clear answer on how to really scale up the target for 2030. The Commission doesn't provide a clear answer how this, the steps that it's proposing, how it fits with the international schedule of basically putting new and more ambitious targets and plans on the table this year because of a too long timeline. So there are some positive elements to it, but overall I can understand the criticism.
Is that what she means, that the European Union is giving up on the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I think there are two elements to it. The one is the level of ambition. And while the Paris Agreement basically says by the middle of the century, we need to be at net zero emissions globally, this means that developed countries like the EU, who have played a much stronger role in the past in terms of producing emissions, need to be there earlier. And this equity dimension, this global equity dimension, is completely missing from the draft proposal. And overall, it's also missing the key next steps that by this year, basically, the EU and in the next 6 months needs to put their new plans on the table, needs to increase the ambition for 2030 to ideally 65% reductions and not only 50 to 55, which the Commission is proposing. And it's not clear how the EU steps up not only the targets for the next 10 years, but really all the measures it can implement in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Okay, Sven, I mean, all right, so let me step over the line and cross over to the other side of the argument. But when you look at it, this no doubt is very revolutionary because it's going to require all EU legislation within 30 years to be in line with net zero emissions.
Well, I think that's definitely an important element to it. And as I said, we have to look at the entire legal framework in the EU, and this law, the idea of this law, I would say, basically can fill this important gap that from the objective of the climate neutrality, all other proposals, all our laws, etc., basically are screened against that. Again, as I said, the ambition of this in terms of the timeline is just not good enough to be really in line with the science. And I think I also heard voices from the European Parliament for some calling for certain improvements in that law, and I think we really need to look at the Parliament here to keep up a stronger voice. And of course, we know that there's opposition from certain countries, including my own one, Germany, and that's of course something we need to push back on. So in a way, it's a step in the right direction, but it's also clear it's not sufficient.
Okay, the European Commission President said this is going to be the compass for the next 3 decades. What else do you want to see as part of this Green Deal in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's some legislation already in place, but what we basically need to see is a revision of the emission reduction targets for 2030. The currently 30% are by far not enough, and we and many others have been saying this for a long time, and they need to be scaled up to ideally 65%. And the signal should come very early this year, not only in September. There is a bit the risk that other countries look at the EU, and if the EU isn't delivering this new target early enough, that they may hold back on presenting their own revised plans in time for the UN Climate Summit end of this year. So I think that's the biggest risk. And the EU Commission hasn't been saying clearly how their timeline fits into that international strategy, and we don't really know whether they give up on that timeline and don't really care about it, or whether they have a different, let's say, strategic approach to it and feel, well, if we have a high-level agreement on the targets, it might be sufficient for the other countries. But I think that's one point. And finally, the other point is the international dimension of that law is not really there. As I said, it lacks the global equity dimension, and we also feel it falls short from any aspects of gender equality, which are important point to consider today. Climate policy.
Sven, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but Sven Harmeling, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us here on TRT World.